Hello everyone, my name is Lucio Constantine, and I'll be reading from a script I wrote for the book Soul Dust by Nicholas Humphrey. Soul Dust by Nicholas Humphrey is a book of philosophy and science on issues of what consciousness is, the nature of the heart problem, whether one can find a solution to the heart problem, and attempts to solve these issues while using relevant data from papers to essays from Thomas Nagel's What It Is Like to Be a Bat to Cormac McCarthy's The Kekule Problem to Thomas Ligotti. Consciousness is a tricky issue. Some scientists scoff at the issue and call it a non-problem. Others write a full-page book on the matter, as is the case with Eric Newman's The Origins and History of Consciousness, and study consciousness at close hand. Humphrey's position is that the heart problem of consciousness can be solved and that it is an illusion, along with the idea that animals also have consciousness. There have been several philosophers and literature writers who wrote about consciousness, like Thomas Nagel in his work The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, to brief mentions about what it means to have a self in Rustin Cole's monologues in True Detective, where consciousness is also proposed as an illusion, and most recently, Sam Esmail's Mr. Robot. Furthermore, this review will focus on Nicholas Humphrey's book, Soul Dust, along with Cormac McCarthy's essay, The Kekule Problem. In Nicholas Humphrey's book, Soul Dust, the author states the following: My book is intended to be a work of serious science and philosophy, and I hope it will be judged as such, but is also written for the general reader. This work is intended to be a serious work of science and philosophy, but also to be treated as a general introduction to new readers. Sometimes when reading for the general audience, the complexity of the subject gets lost in translation for the reader due to having to simplify or ignore certain aspects of a difficult subject, such as space and time, and whether they are fundamental or not. Donald Hoffman, in an interview with Black Freeman, proposes that space-time is not fundamental and that consciousness is also an illusion. Quote, the material world has given human beings magical souls. Human souls have returned the favor and put a magical spell upon the world. To understand these astonishing events, I invite you to start over. End quote. End quote. In this quote, the writer expresses how the material world has given human beings magical souls. Human souls have in return put a magical spell upon the world. To understand these occurrences, one must start over. There are some scientists, say Neil deGrasse Tyson, who suggest we are made of star specks. But how much of these star specks are us? Does one, like a general neutral person, would argue how we don't go around defining ourselves by our chromosomes, would argue that one does not evolve from star material. In section 1, entitled Coming to Explain, in the prelude, the author remarks, quote, chances are it is less than a day since you regained consciousness. It probably happened soon after the sunlight returned this morning. What was it like for you as you came to? Remember, you rub your eyes, stretch your limbs, and before you know it, waves of sensations refill the lake of your being. You are immersed into the subjective present, and once more, you felt yourself alive. You were not alone. Something like this happened today to countless other individuals here on planet Earth. Our planet, we're told, is merely a condensate of stardust, not so different from all the other minor cosmic bodies that litter the universe. Here is where sentiments evolve. Here is where consciousness cells have come into their own. Here lives souls. In this book, I will address the question of the sentience, selfhood, and soulfulness amount to. In the course of it, I will propose a solution to the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem is to explain how an entity made entirely of physical matter, such as a human being, can experience conscious feelings. The problem is hard because such feelings appear to us, or the subjects of them, to have properties that could not possibly be conjured out of matter alone. Page 4. End quote. Nicholas Humphrey proposes that the emergence of the belief in the self or in the programmed development of having a self originated in the origins of star stuff material. Somewhere, someday, consciousness emerged. You have awakened. Like most people, you do not know where you came from, but you are here. The earth is where we make our home. The author then details what the hard problem of consciousness is. The hard problem is to explain how an entity made of physical matter gave rise to an experience of conscious feeling. Moreover, Nicholas Humphrey argues that the hard problem is hard because the feelings, as before mentioned, appear to us have properties that cannot be possibly be erected out of matter alone. Quote, I will argue the truth about consciousness. It is that it is indeed the product of highly improbable but of biological engineering, a wonderful artwork of nature that gives rise to all sorts of mysterious impression in our minds, is something that has relatively straightforward physical explanation. End quote. In this citation, the author says that he will argue about the truth over consciousness, which is that it is indeed the product of highly improbable but of biological engineering. An artwork of nature that gives rise to all sorts of mysterious impressions in our minds is something that has relatively straightforward physical explanation. Oftentimes, things seem complex when they are simple, and other situations shall arise where simple events seem complex. If everything is an illusion, where is the rub? The rub is that consciousness. The rub is that there is no rub. Consciousness, as stated by me, is an illusion. Sam Harris asked in his podcast episode on consciousness about how you can't pinpoint the exact location of consciousness. That is the problem. If no one knows whether it exists, does consciousness hold a concrete basis for the existence of the real? One could allude to the occurrence of a tree falling in the woods where there is no one here to hear it, and one can retort that that too is a product of the mind. What tree? Which woods? Can it be measured? One might argue that the tree fell could be measured, but how is one giving the measurement assured of their own measuring, and who perceives the measure? Quote, there is something to there is something it's like to be him when he experiences feelings, or what philosophers call quality. Quality are features of sensations. End quote. Page 7. Thus arise the nature of consciousness and the introduction of Thomas Nagel's What It's Like to Be a Bet. In the scroll, there is something like him to be him when he experiences feelings. Um, in one of the pages of Thomas Nagel's What It's Like to Be a Bet, Nagel writes, quote, but philosophers share the general human weakness for explanations of what is incomprehensible in terms suited for what is familiar and well understood, though entirely different. Philosophers share the general human weakness for explanations of what is not understood in terms suited for what is familiar and well understood, though entirely different. This means that philosophers have a weakness for what is not understood in terms suited for what is familiar and well understood. Quote, without consciousness, the mind-body problem would be much less interesting. With consciousness, it seems hopeless. The most important and characteristic feature of consciousness material phenomenon is very poorly understood. Most reductionist theories do not even try to explain it, and careful examination will show that no currently available concept of reduction is applicable to it. Perhaps a new theoretical form can be devised for the purpose, but such a resolution, if it exists, lies in a distant intellectual future. Conscious experience is a widespread phenomenon and occurs at many levels of human life, though we cannot be sure of its presence in simpler organisms, and it's very difficult to say in general what provides evidence of it. End quote. Without consciousness, the mind-body problem would be less interesting. Nagel explains, without consciousness, there would be no reason to study consciousness at all. Quite right indeed. But one spoke to consciousness. With consciousness, however, it seems hopeless. The most important and characteristic feature of conscious mental phenomenon is very misunderstood. Right again, but once more, why the need for consciousness? Nagel argues that such a solution to the hard problem of consciousness exists only in the near future. The author of the book, Sold Us by Nicholas Humphrey, argues that this hard problem of consciousness can be solved. Quote, I assume we all believe that bats have experience. After all, they are mammals, and there's more doubt that they have experience than that mice or pigeons or whales have experience. I have chosen bats instead of wasps or flounders because if one travels too far down the phylogenetic tree, people gradually shed their faith that there is experience there at all. Bats, although more closely related to us than those other species, nevertheless present a range of activity and a sensory apparatus so different from ours that the problem I want to pose is exceptionally vivid, though it certainly could be raised with other species, even without the benefit of philosophical reflection. Anyone who has spent time in an enclosed space with an excited bat knows what it is to encounter a fundamentally alien form of life. End quote. Page 438. Here Thomas Nagel assumes that we all believe that bats have experience. This is based upon solely on the fact that they are mammals and that there is no more doubt that they have experience than mice or pigeons or whales have experienced. The reason he has chosen bats over wasps is because if one travels too far down the phylogenetic tree, people gradually shed their belief that there is any experience at all. Anyone who has spent time in a closed space with a bat knows what it is to encounter a fundamentally alien form of life. Quote, I have said that the essence of the belief that bats have experienced is that there is something that is like to be a bat. End quote. Page 438. On page 438, Nagel states that the essence of the belief that a bat has experienced led to the assumption that something knows what it's like to be a bat. End quote. But bat sonar, though clearly a form of perception, is not familiar in its operation to any sense that we possess, and there is no reason to suppose that it is subjective like anything we can experience or imagine. End quote. Page 438. In one passage, the philosopher Thomas Nagel writes that bat sonar is not similar in its operation to any sense that one can inhabit, and there is no reason one to suppose that it is like anything we can experience or imagine. How can we know something without experience? Does one know what love is when one experiences it for the first time? There are emotions that arise throughout the body. One cannot quite place what the experience is, but one knows there is an experience. Is this love? Is this an illusion? Most chemical processes are illusions. As mentioned before, they exist and don't exist. The dualistic approach seems confusing at first, but just as a thing can be good or bad, a thing cannot exist and exist at the same time. A person can believe and not believe in God at the same time. One could talk to an imagined being with reverence and awe of talking to an established deity without knowing with exactitude what the deity is. The history of the development of the deity through space and time would not be fully convinced of the existence of the deity is entirely possible. Quote, thus we describe bat sonar as a form of three-dimensional forward perception. We believe that bats feel some version of pain, feel hunger and lust, and that they have other, more familiar types of perception besides sonar. But we believe that these experiences also have in each case a specific subjective character, but it is beyond our ability to conceive. Page 439. Here the philosopher Thomas Nagel points out that we believe bats feel some version of pain, fear, hunger, and lust. and that they have other more familiar types of perceptions besides sonar. However, we also believe that these experiences have a different character within us. Whence cometh the difference? Who is to be sure that there is a difference? Nicholas Humphrey writes in Soul Dust to experience sensations, quote, as having these features is a form of mental representation to that effect, with the naming of represent still to be decided. Thus, consciousness, or being conscious, as a state of mind, is a cognitive state of entertaining such mental representations. End quote. Page 7. On page 7 of Nicholas Humphrey's Sodas, the author writes that to experience sensations as having features is a form of mental representation to that effect, that consciousness, as a state of mind, is a cognitive state of entertaining such mental representation. But why the need to entertain mental representations? Schopenhauer once remarked that existence is a battle between boredom and suffering. In my times of boredom, unturned by the nature of my life, which is suffering, I too turn to fantasies. Fantasies are banally a means of escape. Escape from what? Suffering. Suffering and boredom are synonymous and fuel each other like coal in the fire. To exist is to either be bored, to feel the need or desire to cease being bored, and to suffer afterwards after either the consequences of no longer having wish to be bored, or to no longer having the wish to have suffered. Several philosophers, whether old from Nietzsche or new from Peter, suggest that suffering promotes growth and a sense of character. I argue that while this is true, there is also useless suffering. And what is what is a beheaded man to a god? Why does God need a beheaded man? What purpose does it serve? If one were honest, none at all. This may seem harsh, but not all murder is with purpose. One need not read Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy or I Claudius by Robert Graves to understand such notions. The parent would argue a child might ask such questions when undergoing a dentist appointment. The parent would argue to fix the child's that the purpose to suffer a dentist appointment is to fix the child's teeth. One could argue, along the lines of Alex O'Connor, that God does not need to allow the suffering of an innocent child in order to fix a child's teeth, when the child could have existed or have been created in a state where there was no need for them to have to fix their teeth. However, the notion that God is kind and caring is misconstrued. One need not read the Old Testament in order to figure out who God really is, or the trials of Job or Jonah in the 4,200 years of existence to account for such a feature. However, the point is that God is uncaring to all except himself. What is one of the commandments of the Bible? That man should have no gods but him. Quote, true, each of us presumably convinced that conscience exists in our own case, and therefore we may want to give the benefit of the doubt to others who so obviously resemble us. But the Andromedon scientist does not know about conscience from her own case. Therefore, if and when she notes a resemblance between herself and any of the earthling creatures she is studying, she is likely to assume they resemble her in this respect as well. And the consciousness is essentialism is right, she will not discover anything in the course of her research to make her revise her opinion. At the end of the day, she will not think she missed anything, so she will return to Andromeda and write a book with a satisfied sense of mission accomplished. Page 12. In this long excerpt, the author refers back to the example of the Andromeda. We are probably convinced that consciousness exists in our own case, and therefore we may want to give the benefit of the doubt to others who so obviously resemble us. Therefore, the Andromedan certainly does. The Andromedan scientist does not know about consciousness from her own case. Therefore, if and when she notes resembles between herself and other creatures, she is likely to assume that they resemble herself. When interacting with others, we assume we are human because we have a conceived notion of what a human being is. To further address the point, does a baby know what it is before language kicks in? No, language and memory are the most important features of being a human. It is often said that humans are forgetful creatures. Nietzsche suggested as such. Most of our lives are either spent forgetting or wishing to forget and having forgotten. Which of our memories are actually real? There is a recent article I read where light sensitivity emissions through repetition can retrieve memory. More research needs to be done. Quote, my starting point is that consciousness, however elusive and enigmatic from a scientific perspective, is a fact of nature, and if it is not evidently a fact of nature, that can be only because scientific philosophers have been looking for evidence in the wrong place. I believe this is I believe this because I think the idea that consciousness has no observable effect is daft, and the notions of a philosophical zombie is dafter still. I do not think it is daft to suppose that certain aspects of consciousness experience could have no observable effects. So before we go further, I want to consider just to what extent conscious experience will or will not be observable to an outsider. We know that everything that goes in the mind of the person or animal has to show in behavior. There can obviously be purely private mental states. Indeed, most ordinary mental states are private insofar as they occur without anyone except the subject knowing about them. No one but you knows what your thoughts are right now. Still, we might want to argue that states states such as these are only contentedly private. End quote. Page 14. In this quote, Nicholas Humphrey states that his starting point is that consciousness is a fact of nature, and if it is a fact of nature, it can be because philosophers have looked in the wrong place. Moreover, the idea of a philosophical zombie is dafter, and that consciousness have no observable effect is daft. The author does not propose that certain conscious experience have no observable effect is daft. The writer further states that we know that not everything that goes on in the mind of a person or animal has to show up in behavior. This can be purely private mental states. Most mental states are private. Finally, no one but you knows what your thoughts are right now. How does one know when one is thinking? One can assert as such. One can present as if one were thinking, and one can know what one is thinking. There are attempts to share thoughts to others through technology. One could only know what this would result in. Quote, my point is that likewise, natural selection need never have known what conscious experience is actually like for the subject. All it must have seen is evidence that conscious experience exists that is in some way enhancing. It is improbable and even quite likely that the detailed phenomenal content of its sensations would not ever have been evident in behavior. End quote. Page 16. In this session, Humphrey writes that the point is that natural selection need never have known what conscious experience is like for the subject. All it must have seen is that conscious experience exists and that it is in some way enhancing. It is impossible and even likely that the detailed phenomenal content of sensations will not ever have been evident in behavior. Emotions and behavior do not need to show up in behavior. I often feel sensations and do not of exhibit symptoms of those feelings. One might sense a feeling of distress when undergoing anxiety. However, if one knows the function and the mechanics of anxiety, one does not need to exhibit signs of anxiety. Well-known manipulators change their behavior all the time successfully because these manipulators know how to control one's emotions. Quote, the big question remains as is whether the scientist, when she examines the brain of someone who is having conscious sensation, can deduce what the person's experience actually is, and not merely deduce a description of what that experience is, and calling it a phenomenological description simply begs the question. Here is a rub. One may insist that if one is a scientist, when one examines the brain of someone having a conscious sensation, can one deduce what the person's experience actually is, and not merely deduce a description of what that experience of what one undergoes a brain examination has experienced. Sight and feeling are very different things. One need not a survey of on emotions and sight to understand such a phenomenon. Oftentimes, knowledge of a thing does not imply experience or wisdom of a thing. Quote, I proposed already in the previous chapter that for someone to be conscious of having a sensation must involve his representing the object of experience as something with properties of a special and peculiar kind. But now this would be taking matters considerably further. It would be suggesting that for someone to be conscious of having a sensation involves his representing the object of experiences as if it is something that it may not be, something that has certainly not been able to affirm it is. Page 29. The author, Nicholas Humphrey, cites Thomas Nagel, who referenced Prolity, that has written an essay named What It's Like to Be a Bat. In which case, as Humphrey states, for someone to be conscious of having a sensation must involve his representing the object of experience as something with properties of a special and peculiar kind. But this would take matters considerably further. It would suggest that for someone to be conscious of having the sensation involves his representing the object of experience as if it's something that it may not be, something he has not certainly been able to confirm it is. What this means is that if something exists, doesn't need to be something else in order for that something else to determine the pre-existing something else entity what its true nature is. For something to describe something, that something must first exist as an existing entity. Without knowledge of the entity, one must conclude that for something to know what thing one A is, one needs one B. The question then becomes, does one A need one B? We will now turn to McCarthy's essay entitled The Kekule Problem. In an excerpt from the New Yorker, it states, quote, his title references a famous eureka moment in the history of science. After years of thoughts and research, the 19th century German chemist August Kekule claimed that he hit upon the ring-like structure of the benzene molecule after he dreamed of a snake eating his own tail. McCarthy calls this the Kekule Problem because it is unclear whether the unconscious supplied a non-linguistic solution to the puzzle of the molecule's configuration. The author of the New Yorker, Nick Romero, states that McCarthy's title refers to the eureka moment in history and science. After years of research, the 19th century German chemist August Kekule claimed he hit upon the ring-like structure of the benzene molecule after he dreamed of a snake eating its own tail. McCarthy calls this the Kekule Problem because no one knows why the consciousness supplied a non-linguistic solution to the puzzle of molecules configuration. One approach is that the only way for an answer to have been given is to have shown the answer non-linguistically, then linguistically. This may seem reductionist and simple-minded, however. To sidestep into Ligotti's work, The Conspiracy of the Human Race, the author suggests that humans are puppets led by a puppet master. As someone who does not believe in free will, I do argue with this position. I do not agree with the conclusion, however, that since reality is inherently met with suffering, then one must walk hand in hand into existence, opting out of a raw deal from God. One must improve and can improve upon existence. The question of how and why is at stake. I do believe that consciousness is a bad thing and leads men to many ills and errors. However, to remove the problem from a larger problem does not solve the bigger problem. As concluded from Sam Esmail's Mr. Robot, one must work from within the system to change the system. Does this work? Is consciousness an illusion? Can the hard problem be solved? Is space-time fundamental? There have been many authors and brilliant minds on the question of consciousness in time and space, and man bound in time and space, from Nicholas Humphrey to Eric Newman in The Origins and History of Consciousness, where he takes the side of the development and continuation of the Ouroboros, the eternal snake eating itself, to Ligotti and Nagel. What is left is to make up your own mind on what consciousness exactly is. So if you would like to, please tell me what your opinions of consciousness is, whether it is illusion, whether it is fundamental, or whether it is simply unimportant, like some other philosophers believe. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.